She fled through the driving rain and collapsed at the iron gates of a sprawling estate where a solitary man found her, never imagining that this lost young woman would unearth something he thought he had buried forever. Can you imagine the sheer desperation of a woman so terrified that she would rather face a raging storm and the unknown than return to her own home? But this story took place in the deep countryside of the state in March of 1934, in an era when a woman's destiny was decided by contracts and obligations, not by her own free will. Before we continue, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from? I love knowing that these stories reach so many different places. And if you are enjoying this, go ahead and hit that like button to help me keep bringing these emotional stories to you. Now, let's get to the story. The rain fell like a whip that March night. Clara Hawthorne clutched her sodden skirt with both hands, stumbling through the mud of a road that led she knew not where. Her leather shoes had lost their heels miles ago, and her feet were bleeding inside them. The biting wind sliced like a razor through the linen dress that clung to her thin frame, and she was shivering so violently her teeth wouldn't stop chattering. 24 years of life, and Clara never imagined she would end up like this, lost, alone, fleeing like a criminal from a fate that others had decided for her. 3 days earlier, she had still been in the city, in her parents' home on Grand Avenue. A house that had once been elegant but now showed signs of decay in every corner. Wallpaper peeling, furniture sold off piece by piece, Persian rugs replaced by cheap mats. The financial decline of the Hawthorne family had been slow but inexorable, like a river drying up in high summer. Her father, Augustus Hawthorne, had been a respected merchant. He imported fine fabrics from Europe, selling to the city's best families. Clara grew up amidst silks and velvets, learned piano from a French tutor, spoke reasonable French, knew how to embroider, play music, and converse about literature. She was raised to marry well, like every young woman of a traditional family, but her father had a vice that corroded their fortune like moths in fine linen. Gambling, cards, horses, any bet that promised to recover what he had already lost. And he never recovered it. He only sank deeper. When Clara turned 20, the house was already mortgaged. When she turned 22, her mother's jewelry had vanished. When she turned 23, there were no more servants, and her mother, Mrs. Laura, cooked and cleaned with her own hands, weeping with shame when old friends passed on the street and averted their gaze. That was when Bernard Vance appeared. A textile merchant like her father had been, but successful owner of 3 emporiums in the capital. 42 years old, a widower with no heirs, a well-groomed mustache, expensive suits, and a gold watch chain strung across his vest. Augustus knew him from business. Bernard had lent money to her father more than once, and now he had come to collect. Not to collect in cash, to collect in flesh. Clara remembered perfectly the night her father called her into the parlour. Bernard was sitting in the armchair that had once belonged to her grandfather, sipping brandy as if he owned the house, which he almost did, considering how many debts Augustus owed him. Her father couldn't look her in the eye when he explained. His voice trembled, but the words came out. Bernard was willing to forgive every single debt, all of them, and even provide a generous sum to the family in exchange for one thing: marriage to Clara. She stood mute. She looked at her father, at her mother weeping against the doorframe, at Bernard, who observed her like someone appraising livestock at a fair. "No," she said. Simple as that. "No." Her father begged. Her mother cried louder. Bernard smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said he understood that she needed time to get used to the idea, but that time was running out. He gave them a month for an answer. During that month, Clara tried to find alternatives. She sought work as a private tutor, but a family in decline couldn't secure recommendations. She tried sewing, but had no machine and no money to buy one. She tried to sell the last valuables she still possessed, a silver brooch from her grandmother, a leather-bound book of French poetry, but the money would barely buy food for a week. And Bernard visited, always polite in front of her parents, always bringing gifts that were chains disguised as kindness, a wool shawl, kidskin gloves. Once he brought a pearl necklace and placed it around her neck with cold hands, lingering longer than necessary, his fingers grazing her skin in a way that made her stomach turn. When they were alone for a moment, he showed his true face. He whispered things in her ear that made her skin crawl with disgust. He told her she would be his either way, that he was being generous by offering marriage, that women like her, from ruined families, had no choice. Once he squeezed her arm so hard, it left purple bruises for a week. Clara realized this wasn't a man looking for a wife. It was a predator looking for prey. On the day the deadline expired, the family gathered again in the parlor. Bernard was there, confident. Augustus begged with his eyes. Laura wept silently. And Clara, feeling she was betraying herself but seeing no other way out, said yes. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later. Bernard wanted a discreet ceremony, no fanfare. Clara understood why when she heard whispers in the neighborhood. He had a reputation. His first wife had died in strange circumstances, a fall down the stairs, but there were rumors. Servants who had worked in his house told stories of screams, of broken doors, of bruises the late wife hid with makeup and long sleeves. It was 3 days before the wedding that Clara made her decision. She wasn't going to marry him. She was going to run. She didn't tell her parents. She knew they would try to stop her, that their desperation was greater than their love for her at that point. She packed what little she could carry in a small bundle. A change of clothes, the silver brooch she hadn't sold, a few saved coins, the book of poetry. She waited for the night her parents slept, exhausted from crying and planning a wedding that felt like a funeral. She climbed out the bedroom window, shimmied down the trellis that creaked dangerously, and walked through the dark streets of the city to the train station. She bought a ticket to the countryside with the money she had, no specific destination, just away. The train departed at dawn. Clara shrank into a bench in 3rd class among farmhands and peddlers, trying to become invisible. With every station that passed, she felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. Every mile was distance between her and Bernard, but she underestimated the reach of a humiliated man's rage. At the 3rd stop, she saw 2 men boarding the carriage, scanning the passengers intently. They wore dark suits, hats pulled low, and one held a piece of paper. Investigators. Bernard had sent private detectives after her. Panic. Clara waited for the train to slow down at the next curve and jumped. She rolled down the embankment, tore her skirt, bruised her shoulder. She got up and ran into the woods bordering the tracks. She heard shouts behind her, the train whistling, but she didn't look back. She walked all day through the woods, hiding whenever she heard voices. When night fell, she found a dirt road. She began to follow it, not knowing where it went, and that was when the storm began. A cold autumn rain that turned the paths to mud and washed away any tracks. Clara thanked God for the rain, even as she shivered with cold. If the investigators were still looking, they wouldn't be able to track her. But the rain also drained her last reserves of strength. She had eaten only a few wild berries during the day. She was soaked to the bone. The fever was already starting, that strange heat on her forehead contrasting with the tremors of her body. The road seemed endless, rising and falling over hills covered in grass. There were no houses, no lights, only darkness and rain. Clara tripped over a stone and fell to her knees in the mud. She tried to stand. Her legs didn't obey. She dragged herself a few yards, but her strength was failing. She saw dark spots in her vision, not knowing if they were from the night or imminent fainting. That was when she saw the gates. Large wrought iron, with an oil lantern hanging on one of the pillars, swinging in the wind. Through the rain, she could make out the property beyond the gates. A massive house, lights in the windows, immense trees surrounding it, an estate. It was a farm estate. Clara dragged herself to the gates. They were locked, but she managed to slip her hand through the bars, as if she could reach that distant light. "Help!" she tried to scream, but her voice came out too weak to be heard through the storm. The world spun. She tasted blood in her mouth where she had bitten, her tongue falling. She felt the cold mud against her face. She felt her consciousness slipping away like water through fingers, and she fainted there, collapsed against the iron gates of a farm whose owner she didn't even know, in a strange land, without a soul in the entire world who knew where she was. The last thing her mind registered before total darkness was a thought that was almost a prayer. "Please, let someone find me before they find me." Dawn brought silence after the storm. The washed sky showed that intense blue of autumn, with white clouds racing fast, pushed by the wind that still blew cold. The ground steamed with vapor under the first rays of sun, the soaked earth exhaling the scent of wet clay and grass. Edward Montgomery rode along the north fence of the property, checking for storm damage as he did every morning after a heavy rain. 48 years old, broad shoulders, a face weathered by sun and wind, dark hair with silver strands at the temples. He wore heavy riding breeches, worn leather boots, and a riding coat that had belonged to his father. He rode with the upright posture of a man who grew up in the saddle before he learned to walk. Willow Creek Estate spanned 5,000 acres of rolling fields, herds of cattle that produced the finest beef in the region, and sheep whose wool was fought over at auctions. The main house, built by Edward's grandfather in the middle of the previous century, was an imposing structure of stone and hardwood, with wide verandas and a clay roof that withstood any storm. Around the house, ancient pines stood silent guard. Edward Montgomery was a rich man, very rich, but wealth did not warm lonely nights nor fill the silences. 3 years. It had been 3 years since Isabel had died. He avoided thinking about it, but mornings were the worst. Because in the morning, for a fraction of a second upon waking, he would forget. He would still reach across to the side of the bed where she used to sleep. He would still expect to hear her voice calling from the hallway. And then he would remember, and the day would begin with that weight in his chest that never really went away. Isabel had been the love of his youth. They married when he was 25, and she 23. 20 years of a happy marriage. She turned the house into a home, planted gardens, created a library, filled the rooms with laughter. They wanted children for years, but they didn't come. Isabel suffered with every month that passed without a pregnancy, feeling she was failing as a wife, though Edward repeated tirelessly that she was enough, that they were happy as they were. When she finally fell pregnant at 40, it was pure joy. 9 months of hope, of preparing the nursery, of dreaming about the future. And then the complicated labor, a hemorrhage the doctors couldn't staunch, a baby that didn't survive. Edward lost his wife and son on the same winter night in 1931. Since then, he lived mechanically. He managed the estate because it was what he knew how to do, but without pleasure. He received the foreman, gave orders, checked numbers, but like an automaton. He refused social invitations, ignored the widows and daughters of neighboring landowners who tried to get close. Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper who had cared for him since he was a child, worried seeing her employer waste away emotionally, but nothing she said made a difference. Edward simply existed. He did not live. It was while riding near the main gates that he saw her. From a distance, it looked like a pile of rags thrown against the gate. He almost ignored it, thinking it was a branch torn off by the storm. But something made him look twice. The shape was wrong for a branch. He spurred his horse. As he approached, the reality of what he was seeing took shape. A woman. It was a woman lying on the muddy ground, leaning against the gate bars, soaked and torn clothes clinging to her body, brown hair plastered to a pale face. She wasn't moving. Edward dismounted before the horse even came to a complete stop. He knelt beside her, heart racing. Dead, was his first thought, but when he touched her wrist, he felt a weak but present beat. Alive. He turned her over carefully. She was young, he realized. A delicate face even soiled with mud, long lashes, lips turned purple by the cold. She was burning with fever, the skin of her forehead scorching under his calloused fingers. She was unconscious, breathing shallowly, shivering even while passed out. Edward didn't think. He just acted. He lifted her in his arms, startled by how light she was, almost nothing. He placed her across the front of the saddle, mounted behind her, holding her firmly against his chest, and galloped back to the house. Mrs. Higgins was on the porch when he arrived. One look, and she understood the urgency. She ran inside, shouting for the maids to prepare the guest room, hot water, blankets. Edward climbed the stairs carrying the unknown young woman, entering for the first time in months the rooms of the east wing that had remained closed since Isabel died. They placed her in the bed of the blue room, the one Isabel used for guests. Mrs. Higgins, with 60 years of experience caring for people, took command. She ordered Edward out while she and the maids removed the woman's wet clothes, washed away the mud, and dressed her in a clean nightgown. They called Dr. Vincent from the village, who arrived an hour later. Edward waited in the library, pacing from one side to the other like a caged animal. He didn't understand his own agitation. It was merely an act of charity, he told himself. Anyone would have done the same. But his hands trembled as he poured a shot of brandy he didn't even manage to drink. Dr. Vincent came down 2 hours later. Early-stage pneumonia, he diagnosed. Severe exhaustion, malnutrition, injuries to the feet, but young and strong. With proper care, she would recover. He left medications, instructions, and promised to return the next day. She slept for 2 whole days. Edward caught himself going up the stairs several times a day to ask Mrs. Higgins about the young woman's condition. The housekeeper watched him with shrewd eyes, but commented on nothing, only informing him that the fever was breaking, that she had taken broth, that she murmured in her sleep but didn't wake. On the 3rd day, she woke up. Edward was in the library when Mrs. Higgins came to call him. "She is awake and frightened," said the housekeeper. "I think it best you speak with her, sir." He went up, heart beating faster than it should. He knocked on the door of the blue room. He entered when he heard a weak voice saying, "Come in." Clara was sitting up in bed, propped against pillows, her brown hair loose over her shoulders, wearing a white nightgown that had belonged to Isabel. She was pale, enormous brown eyes in a thin face, hands clutching the sheet tightly, and scared, visibly scared. Edward stopped at the door, suddenly not knowing what to say. "Good morning," he managed finally. "How are you feeling?" Clara observed him in silence for a moment that seemed eternal. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "At Willow Creek Estate," he replied, still standing by the door, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her further. "My farm. I am Edward Montgomery. I found you fainted at the gates the morning after the storm. I brought you here. The doctor said you had early pneumonia, but you are recovering." She processed the information. Her eyes scanned the room, then returned to him. "How long have I been unconscious?" 2 days. Panic crossed her face. 2 days. She tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't support her. Edward took 2 steps to help, but she recoiled, raising her hand. "No," she said with a voice that trembled. "Don't come near." He froze. "I won't hurt you," he said calmly. "You are safe here." Her eyes filled with tears she fought to hold back. "How can I know that? You are a stranger." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. It was genuine fear in her look, not the common fear of waking up in an unknown place. It was the fear of someone who had been hunted. "You're right," he said calmly. "I am a stranger, but I found you dying of cold and brought you here. That is all. Dr. Vincent tended to you, Mrs. Higgins too. When you are better, if you wish to leave, you are free to go. But while you are sick, please let us take care of you." Something in his tone, in the simple sincerity of the words, made Clara relax minimally. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she murmured. She stopped, not knowing how to explain without revealing too much. Edward understood she had secrets, and he respected that. "You don't need to explain anything," he said gently. "Rest. Mrs. Higgins will bring food. Anything you need, just ask." And he left, closing the door softly. Clara remained alone in the blue room, listening to his footsteps fading down the hallway. She looked out the window and saw immense fields, blue sky, freedom, but along with relief, there was confusion. Who was that man? Why did the sadness she saw in his eyes seem deeper than an ocean? The following days established a delicate routine. Clara stayed in the room, regaining strength. Mrs. Higgins came up 3 times a day with trays of food, chatted a little, brought clean clothes. The housekeeper had a maternal way that made Clara feel a safety she hadn't felt in months. Edward visited once a day, always in the late afternoon. He would knock on the door, enter only if she permitted, stay for a few minutes. He asked how she was, if she needed anything, spoke about the weather or the farm. Superficial conversations, but there was something in the pauses between words, in the way he avoided looking directly at her for too long, in the care with which he chose every sentence, and Clara, even weak, even frightened, began to notice things. The sadness he carried on his shoulders like an invisible weight, the way he looked out the window as if seeing ghosts, the strong hands that trembled slightly when he held his hat. Edward Montgomery was a man broken on the inside. A week after waking up, Clara managed to get up. She walked to the window, leaning on the furniture. She saw the estate's fields stretching as far as the eye could see, herds of cattle like dark dots in the vast green, workers on horseback driving the livestock. It was beautiful in a way that squeezed the chest, visual freedom contrasting with the prison that had almost been her fate. It was on this afternoon that Edward arrived for his daily visit and found Clara standing near the window. She wore a simple dress Mrs. Higgins had arranged, her hair tied in a loose bun, still pale, but visibly stronger. "You're better," he said, and for the first time there was a shadow of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I am," replied Clara. "Thanks to you, sir." "Edward," he said. "You can call me Edward." There was a pause. "Clara," she said finally. "My name is Clara." Clara," he repeated, and the name sounded different in his deep voice, almost like music. They stood there, her near the window, him near the door, yards of distance between them that seemed simultaneously too great and too small. It was Mrs. Higgins entering with a tea tray that broke the moment. In the following days, Clara began to explore the house. First, just the hallway of her room, then the stairs, holding firm to the banister, then the parlour, the veranda. Willow Creek Estate was beautiful, full of well-kept antique furniture, family portraits on the walls, a library with hundreds of leather-bound books. It was in the library that Clara came to spend her time. She loved to read. And Edward, she discovered, did too. He found her there one afternoon, leafing through a volume of poetry. "Do you like poetry?" he asked. Clara nodded. "I used to read when—" She stopped. "When I had another life," she completed mentally. "When I had a home, family, a future." Edward didn't press, but he pointed to a shelf. "Tennyson. If you like poetry, you'll like him." And so it began. Conversations about books, about poems, about stories they read. Edward discovered that Clara was educated, cultured, that she had a sharp mind and her own opinions. Clara discovered that Edward read voraciously, that he had a quiet intelligence, that behind the sadness was a man of rare depth. The conversations grew longer. From 15 minutes to half an hour, from half an hour to hours. They sat in the library, her in an armchair near the window, him in the leather chair that had been his father's. They talked about everything except what really mattered. She didn't speak of where she came from, nor why she was running. He didn't speak of his dead wife, nor the grief that consumed him. But there was something growing between them in those charged silences. An awareness. An interest that neither of the two wanted to admit. Edward found himself waiting anxiously for the time to go to the library, choosing clothes with more care, paying attention to his own reflection for the first time in years, and feeling guilt for it. How could he be interested in another woman? Was it a betrayal of Isabel's memory? Clara found herself waiting for his step in the hallway, smiling more than she should when he entered, watching his hands holding the books, imagining, and then reprimanding herself. She was there as a charity case, a refugee. She had no right to feel what she was feeling. And he was older, rich, probably just being kind to an unfortunate girl. It was Mrs. Higgins who noticed first. She watched the two with eyes of someone who had known Edward since he was a child. She saw the master smiling again, speaking more, leaving the library with lighter steps. She saw Clara blushing when Edward arrived, fixing her hair unconsciously, looking at the door even when he wasn't there. The housekeeper said nothing, but she prayed quietly. She prayed that this lost girl would be the medicine Edward needed. That destiny had brought Clara to the farm for a reason greater than chance, because sometimes, thought Mrs. Higgins, God puts the right people in our path when we need them most and expect them least. But there were shadows on the horizon that none of them saw yet, because Clara had left tracks, and determined men always find tracks, sooner or later. In the city, Bernard Vance held a telegram he had just received. The investigators had news. A young woman matching the description had been seen boarding a train to the interior. She had jumped off in the rural region near the state line. Isolated farms in the area. The search continued. Bernard crumpled the paper in his hand, jaw clenched. Did Clara think she could run from him? Did she think she could humiliate him, leave him in front of an empty church, make him a joke in high society? She was going to pay for this. When he found her, she would learn that women do not run from Bernard Vance. He gave orders to the investigators. Keep looking. Every farm, every village, every house. Money is no object. I want her found. And meanwhile, at Willow Creek Estate, Clara and Edward shared tea on the veranda at sunset, talking about books and fields and birds flying north, unaware that time was running out, that reality was coming like a storm on the horizon, and that soon they would have to decide what they really felt for each other, because love that grows in silence eventually needs a voice. And sometimes the voice needs to be a war cry. 2 weeks had passed since Clara woke up in that unknown bed. April advanced, bringing frosty mornings that whitened the fields, and the ancient oaks stood out even greener against the crystal-clear autumn sky. Clara had recovered completely from the pneumonia. Her strength returned, and with it a restlessness she didn't quite know how to name, because staying at Willow Creek Estate was starting to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like something dangerously close to home. And that frightened her as much as it comforted her. Mornings had their own rhythm now. Clara woke early, helped Mrs. Higgins in the kitchen, even with the housekeeper protesting that guests shouldn't work. But Clara needed to occupy herself, needed to feel useful instead of a burden. She kneaded bread, peeled potatoes, prepared sweets with fruit from the orchard. Mrs. Higgins eventually gave in, and the two women worked side by side in the large kitchen, talking about recipes and weather and small things that filled the silence. Mrs. Higgins was discreet, but gradually she told stories about Edward as a boy, stubborn and brave, who broke horses before his time and came back with scraped knees but smiling. About his marriage to Isabel, a beautiful summer ceremony, the whole estate decorated. About the couple's happy years, about how Isabel brought life to that house. And about the tragedy, the labor that went wrong, the double loss that broke Edward into pieces he was still trying to put together. Clara listened and understood. His sadness made sense now, and along with understanding came a dangerous tenderness, a desire to fix what was broken in him, knowing she had no right to try. Edward, for his part, changed his routine in a way he didn't even realize was conscious. Before, he drank coffee alone before dawn and spent the whole day in the fields, returning only at nightfall. Now he had coffee at the kitchen table when Clara was there, talking about the day's plans, listening to her talk about the books she was reading. He returned for lunch when before he ate in the bunkhouse with the hands. He found excuses to pass through the library during the afternoon, where Clara inevitably was. The servants noticed and commented in low voices. The boss was different, lighter, smiling again, and it had all started when that girl appeared. It was on a particularly beautiful autumn afternoon that something changed between them. Clara was in the side garden of the house, where Isabel had planted rose bushes that Mrs. Higgins kept alive with stubbornness. Clara didn't know that was Isabel's garden. She just found the place lovely, with the red and white roses still blooming despite the cold. She was watering the flowers when Edward arrived on horseback. He dismounted and stood still, observing Clara there among the rose bushes, the afternoon sun illuminating her brown hair, and something squeezed his chest with such force it almost hurt. She was in Isabel's garden, and instead of feeling betrayal or pain, he felt rightness, as if Clara belonged in that place, as if she had always belonged. Clara sensed his presence and turned. She smiled, that smile that had become more frequent in recent weeks. "These roses are beautiful," she said. "Whoever planted them had talent." Edward's smile faltered. "My wife," he said quietly. "Isabel. It was her garden." Clara paled, dropping the watering can. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be here. Edward raised a hand, interrupting. "No," he said, and there was surprise in his own voice. "It's all right. Actually," he paused, searching for words, "I think she would like to know someone is taking care of her flowers." Clara observed him, seeing the pain in his eyes, but also something more. Acceptance, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "You still miss her very much," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Edward nodded, approaching the roses, touching a red petal with care. "Every day," he admitted. 20 years married. You don't forget 20 years, nor should you." A gentle silence fell between them. Clara found herself wanting to touch his arm, to comfort him somehow, but she didn't dare. "How did she die?" she asked softly. "If it's not too painful to speak of." Edward took a deep breath. "Childbirth," he said. "We tried to have children for years. When we finally succeeded, she was 40, a difficult pregnancy from the start, but she was so happy. She said it was worth any suffering. And then," his voice cracked, "the baby was born dead. She had a hemorrhage. The doctors couldn't stop it. I lost both of them in the same night." Clara felt tears prickling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Edward." He looked at her then, really looked, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart accelerate. "Do you know what is hardest?" he asked. "It's not the pain of the loss, it's the guilt of continuing to live, of waking up every day, of feeling the sun on my face and knowing she will never feel it again. And worse." He hesitated. the guilt of thinking that maybe one day I might be happy again. You deserve to be happy, Clara said with an intensity that surprised her. She wouldn't want you to stay trapped in grief forever. How do you know? He asked, not with anger but with genuine curiosity. Because, said Clara, anyone who loved you truly would want your happiness above all else, even above their memory. Edward remained silent for a long moment. Then he reached out, picked a white rose, and offered it to Clara. Isabel used to say white roses mean a new beginning, he said quietly. Clara took the flower, fingers brushing his for a brief second that seemed to last an eternity. Thank you, she whispered. They stayed there in the garden until the sun began to set, talking about loss and life and new beginnings. And when they returned to the house, there was something different between them. An opening. A possibility suspended in the air like a promise. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She stayed at the bedroom window, looking at the fields bathed in moonlight, the white rose in a glass of water on the nightstand. Her heart was confused. She felt things for Edward she had no right to feel. He was older, a widower, still grieving, and she was a fugitive, hiding with a past that would eventually catch up. By the way, if you are enjoying this story, leave a like to help me keep bringing these emotional tales to you. But the heart didn't obey logic, and every time she thought of leaving, of departing the farm before getting hurt, something inside her resisted. She didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay. She wanted to know more of this silent man who carried sadness on his shoulders but held kindness in his eyes. Edward didn't sleep either. He stayed in the library, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table, looking at the portrait of Isabel he kept on the shelf. He talked to her as he did sometimes in a low voice, as if she could hear. I met someone, he told the portrait. A girl I found dying at the gates. He paused, searching for words. She makes me feel again, Isabel. After 3 years dead inside, I feel something, and I feel terrible for it, as if I were betraying you. The portrait obviously didn't answer, but Edward looked into Isabel's painted eyes and remembered her in life. Remembered the conversations they had about death, about the future, about what would happen if one of them left first. Isabel had made him promise he wouldn't live in mourning forever. Promise me, Edward, she had said, holding his hands, that you will live, that you will be happy, that you will love again if you find someone. I don't want you to bury yourself with me, he had promised, but promises are easier to make than to keep. The following days brought subtle but perceptible changes. Edward began to take better care of himself. He shaved with more attention, wore better clothes, combed his hair. Small things that Mrs. Higgins noticed and smiled at approvingly. Clara changed too. The pallor of fear was being replaced by a healthy color in her cheeks. She laughed more, relaxed. Began to believe that perhaps she was safe there. They spent more time together. Edward took her to see the farm. They rode through the fields, him showing the herds, explaining about cattle breeding, pointing out the property lines. Clara rode well, which surprised him, and she explained she had learned as a child when the family still had money and stables. It was during these rides that she began to tell. Not everything, but fragments. She spoke about the family that had means and lost them, about the father who gambled, about the marriage arranged to pay debts. She didn't say the fiancé's name, nor details of the escape, but Edward understood enough. He understood she had run for her life, not on a whim. He understood the fear in her eyes when she woke up was justified. He didn't ask more than she was willing to tell. But something in him changed. A protective instinct that had slept for years woke up. The idea of anyone hurting Clara, of anyone forcing her to anything, made anger rise in him like a wave. "You are safe here," he said one afternoon, the two sitting under a huge oak tree, horses grazing nearby. "As long as you wish to stay, this is your home." Clara looked at him, grateful, but also frightened by how much those words meant to her. "And if they find me?" she asked quietly. "Those I am running from. If they discover where I am." "Then I deal with them," Edward said simply, but there was steel in his voice. "Why?" Clara asked, turning to face him. "Why would you do that for me? I am nobody, just a girl you found by chance." Edward stared back, and in that moment, under the shade of the oak with the wind whispering in the branches above, he spoke the truth. "Because you made me live again, Clara. Because when I look at you, I feel something I thought I would never feel again. And that scares me and gives me hope at the same time." The air between them became charged. Clara felt her heart race. "Edward," she whispered, but didn't know what to say after his name. He approached slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. But she didn't retreat. She stood still, eyes on his, breath suspended. He raised his hand, touched her face with immense delicacy, as if she were made of porcelain. "May I?" he asked softly. Clara nodded, unable to speak. And Edward kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, almost reverent, his lips touching hers with care, like the first kiss of a nervous teenager. But there was emotion there that went beyond desire. It was connection. It was recognition. It was two lonely people finding a harbor in one another. When they separated, both were trembling. Clara had tears in her eyes. Edward rested his forehead against hers. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize," Clara interrupted. "Please don't apologize." They returned to the house in silence, but it was a silence loaded with meaning. Something had changed irrevocably. A line had been crossed, and neither of the two knew whether to rejoice or be terrified. That night, Edward went to Clara's room. He knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he simply said, "I don't want you to think I am taking advantage of the situation. You are here because you need refuge, and that doesn't change. But you need to know that what I feel is real. It isn't pity. It isn't loneliness. It is you." Clara held his hand. "I know," she said, "and what I feel is also real. But I am afraid, Edward. Afraid of what happens when the past catches up to me. Because it will catch up sooner or later. Then we face it together," he said. "If you want to." She pulled him into the room, closed the door. They sat on the edge of the bed, hands intertwined, talking until dawn. About fears and hopes. About Isabel and the respect Clara had for her memory. About the violent fiancé and the despair that had led Clara to flee. About the uncertain future both wanted but didn't know if they could have. It was that night they became truly intimate. Not physically, but emotionally. They opened the most vulnerable parts of themselves to one another. And when Edward finally left at dawn, before the servants woke up to avoid gossip, both knew there was no going back. They were falling in love. Perhaps they were already in love. The following days were of cautious happiness. They stole moments together, hands brushing when passing books, glances that lasted longer than they should, secret smiles across the dinner table, horseback rides that ended with stolen kisses far from curious eyes. Mrs. Higgins knew. Obviously she knew, but she approved silently. She saw the master alive again, laughing again. And she saw Clara blooming, ceasing to be a frightened girl to become a confident woman. But the outside world eventually invades paradises, and the invasion began on an afternoon in late April. Thomas, the foreman, came to the house with a worried expression. "Boss," he said to Edward, "there are 2 men in the village asking questions. They say they are looking for a missing girl. They describe someone who sounds very much like Miss Clara." Edward felt his blood run cold. "Where are they now?" "At Jack's general store," replied Thomas, "talking to everyone, showing a sketched portrait, offering a reward for information." Edward thought quickly. "Did anyone speak about Clara?" Thomas shook his head. "Not so far. The farm folk are loyal to you. They won't talk. But in the village there are people who talk too much for money. It's a matter of time." Edward nodded. "Thank you, Thomas. Keep your ears open. Any news, warn me immediately." When the foreman left, Edward stood in the middle of the room, mind racing. He had to tell Clara, and they had to decide what to do. He found her in the library. When she saw his expression, she paled. "They've arrived," she said. It wasn't a question. Edward nodded. "2 men in the village looking for you. They don't know you're here yet, but they will find out." Clara stood up, hands shaking. "I have to leave. Now. Before they find out. I can't bring trouble to you." Edward held her shoulders. "You aren't running again. No more running." "Then what do I do?" Clara asked, voice breaking. "I can't go back to him, Edward. I'd rather die." "You aren't going back," Edward said firmly. "And you aren't going to die. We are going to solve this." "How?" Edward took a deep breath. "Marry me." Clara blinked, certain she had heard wrong. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated. "If you are my wife, legally, he has no more right over you. The contract your parents made becomes null. You fall under my protection, and I have enough money and influence to keep him away." Clara shook her head. "I can't let you do this. It's madness. You barely know me. And I would bring scandal, problems." "I know you enough," Edward interrupted, "and I want to do this, not just to protect you, though I want to, but because I love you, Clara. I know it's fast, I know it's crazy, but it's true." Tears streamed down her face. "I love you too," she whispered, "but what if you regret it? What if this ruins your life?" "My life was already ruined," he said quietly. "You gave it back to me. Let me protect what gave it back." Clara looked into his eyes and saw absolute truth. He was offering not just protection, but a future, a family, love, everything she thought she had lost forever. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I will marry you." They embraced there in the library, knowing the battle was just beginning. Because marriage would solve the legality, but it wouldn't solve a violent man who didn't accept losing. Bernard would come, and when he came, it wouldn't be with papers and lawyers. It would be with rage and vengeance. But for the first time, Clara wasn't alone. She had someone by her side. She had love. And sometimes love is armor stronger than any other. Edward sent for Father Lucas that same night. The priest came confused and was shocked when Edward explained he wanted to marry immediately. "But Edward, this is precipitous," protested the priest. "You barely know one another, and the memory of Mrs. Isabel—" "Isabel has been dead for 3 years," Edward said with respect but firmness, "and she made me promise I would live. Clara needs protection, and I need her. We love each other. It is sufficient." The priest looked from Edward to Clara, saw the determination in both and sighed. "I need time to prepare. Documents, bans." "We don't have time," Edward cut in. "Those looking for her are in the village. I need you to perform a simple ceremony right here tomorrow. As a friend, as a favor." Father Lucas hesitated. "I will need witnesses and proof that she's free to marry." Clara, still without revealing her full name to the priest, assured him she was single, that there had never been an official marriage, only a family contract she refused. Edward offered Mrs. Higgins and Thomas as witnesses. The priest, seeing there was no dissuading them, reluctantly agreed. The ceremony was set for the late afternoon of the next day. Simple, in the small chapel the Montgomery family maintained at the back of the property. Just the bride and groom, the priest, and the 2 witnesses. Clara spent the next day in a state of nervousness that oscillated between happiness and panic. Mrs. Higgins brought a simple white dress that had been Isabel's, hastily adjusted to fit Clara. "Is it not bad luck?" Clara asked, touching the delicate fabric. Mrs. Higgins shook her head. Mrs. Isabel was a generous woman. She would approve. And look. The housekeeper took an antique silver brooch from her pocket. It was hers. I want you to use it, so that she is present in some way, blessing you both. Clara took the brooch with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. At dusk, when the sun painted the sky orange and pink, Clara walked to the chapel on the arm of Thomas, who assumed the role of the father she didn't have there. Edward waited for her at the altar, wearing a dark suit, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. The ceremony was short but emotional. Father Lucas conducted the traditional vows. Edward held Clara's hands and promised to love her, protect her, honor her all the days of his life. Clara, voice trembling, promised the same. They had no ring, so Edward took the ring with the Montgomery family crest from his finger and placed it on hers. Too big, spinning on her thin finger, but significant nonetheless. I declare you husband and wife, said the priest, and may God protect you. Edward kissed Clara there in the small chapel, sealing a commitment that was simultaneously a practical solution and a promise of love. Mrs. Higgins wept openly. Thomas smiled, and outside the wind made the oaks whisper, as if they were blessing the union too. But a few miles away, at Jack's General Store, the investigators had finally gotten information. A drunken farmhand, tempted by the generous reward, told of a girl who appeared at Willow Creek Estate weeks ago. Young, pretty, brown hair. The boss, Edward Montgomery, took her in. She was still there. The investigators sent a telegram immediately. The runaway bride had been found, and Bernard Vance, upon receiving the news in the city, smiled a joyless smile. Finally, he prepared to travel. This time, he would go personally, and Clara was going to learn that running from him had consequences, painful ones. The storm was coming. And Edward and Clara, newlyweds, still didn't know how violent it would be. The first week as husband and wife was strange and sweet at the same time. Edward insisted Clara move into the master bedroom, but she hesitated, feeling she was invading Isabel's sacred space. He was patient. They stayed in separate rooms initially, building a marriage little by little, with mutual respect that was rare in rushed unions. But they slept little, both of them. Edward, because he listened for every noise in the night, expecting invaders. Clara, because she had nightmares where Bernard found her and ripped away her newfound happiness. During the day, they tried to maintain normalcy. Edward taught Clara about farm administration. She had a sharp mind for numbers and quickly understood the ledgers, the purchases, the sales. They rode together through the fields, and he showed her every corner of the property that was now hers too. They talked for hours, discovering likes and dislikes, dreams and fears. They laughed together, something neither had done for so long they had almost forgotten how. At night, they dined in the large dining room, now with lit candles and fresh flowers on the table. Small changes Clara brought that made the house seem less like a mausoleum and more like a home. After dinner, they sat in the library, her reading aloud while he listened, or simply talking until late. And gradually they became closer, a goodnight kiss that lasted longer, hands intertwined during walks, hugs that became more frequent and prolonged. They were building not just an alliance of protection, but a true marriage, love that grew every day. It was Mrs. Higgins who brought the bad news. "Sir," she said one morning, face worried, "Thomas just returned from the village. The investigators are still there. And there is more. A man arrived yesterday from the city. They describe him as rich, well-dressed, furious. He is asking more aggressive questions, threatening those who don't cooperate." "Bernard," Clara whispered, the blood draining from her face. "He came personally." Edward stood up, jaw clenched. "How much time do we have?" "Thomas thinks a day, maybe two," replied Mrs. Higgins. "He's in the village interrogating everyone. Someone will end up talking about the marriage." "Good," Edward said with a calm he didn't feel. Then let him come. Clara is my wife now, legally. He has no more right over her. But Clara knew Bernard better. He won't accept that, she said, voice trembling. Legality doesn't matter to him. He will... She stopped, unable to verbalize her fears. Edward held her shoulders. Look at me, he said firmly. He isn't going to take you. He isn't going to touch you. As long as I am breathing, you are safe. But there was fear in his eyes too, because desperate men do desperate things. And a humiliated man seeking revenge was dangerous. Edward spent the day preparing. He gathered the most trustworthy hands, explained the situation vaguely, asked them to stay alert. He sent for Dr. Vincent and Father Lucas, asking them to come to the farm and serve as civilized witnesses to what was about to happen. He hid Clara in the house, away from windows, and they waited. Bernard Vance arrived late the following afternoon. An expensive carriage, thoroughbred horses, 2 armed thugs by his side. He stopped in front of the main house of Willow Creek Estate with the arrogance of someone accustomed to getting what he wants. Edward received him on the veranda. He was alone, apparently unarmed, but Thomas and 3 hands were strategically positioned near the stables, rifles within reach. "Are you Edward Montgomery?" Bernard asked, stepping down from the carriage. He was a man of average height, well-dressed, waxed moustache, eyes cold as stone. He carried a silver-headed cane that likely hid a blade. "I am," Edward replied without descending from the veranda, maintaining the height advantage. "And you are?" "Bernard Vance," he said, as if the name should mean something. "I came to fetch my fiancée, Clara Hawthorne. I know she is here." Edward crossed his arms. "Your fiancée? Interesting, because Clara Hawthorne doesn't exist anymore. Now she's Clara Montgomery, my wife." Bernard's face turned red. "Your what?" "Wife," Edward repeated calmly. "We married 8 days ago. Father Lucas officiated. Everything legal and documented, so any right you thought you had over her has become null." "You are lying," Bernard hissed, climbing the veranda steps aggressively. His thugs moved too, hands on their holsters. Edward's men responded by stepping out of the shadows, rifles visible. Bernard stopped. "I am not lying," Edward said, "and I suggest your men do nothing precipitate. You are outnumbered and on private property." Bernard looked around, assessing the situation. He took a deep breath, forcing control. "She is mine," he said through gritted teeth. "Her father owes me. We have a contract." "Had a contract," Edward corrected, "for a marriage that never happened. She chose to refuse. It is her right." "She has no rights," Bernard shouted, losing composure. "I paid her father's debts. She has purchased merchandise." That was when Clara appeared in the doorway. Edward tried to stop her, but she walked past him, descending the steps slowly. She wore a simple but dignified dress, hair pinned up, posture erect. She looked different from the terrified girl who had fled weeks ago. She looked stronger. "I am not merchandise," she said, voice steady despite internal tremors. "I am a person, and I refuse to be treated as property." Bernard looked at her with a mixture of rage and sick desire that made Edward's stomach turn. "Clara," he said with false gentleness, "you have caused many problems, but I am a generous man. Come back with me now, marry me as promised, and I forget this indiscretion." "Never," Clara said. "I would rather die." "That can be arranged," Bernard said quietly, dangerously. Edward descended the steps rapidly, placing himself between Clara and Bernard. "Threats won't work here," he said with a voice that cut like a razor. "Clara is my wife, under my protection, and I strongly suggest you leave before this gets uglier." Bernard laughed, a sound without humor. "You think a rushed marriage changes anything? I will go to the courts. I have documents, contracts signed by her father. I will annul this fake marriage and drag her back even if it's by chains." "Then you will have to drag me too," Edward said, "and it won't be easy." That was when Father Lucas arrived, accompanied by Dr. Vincent. The two men had heard Edward ask them to come serve as witnesses and arrived at the right moment. "What is happening here?" the priest asked, voice authoritative. Bernard turned. "Priest? Perfect. You can explain to this man that a forced marriage is not valid before God." "The marriage was not forced," Father Lucas said calmly. "I officiated. Both consented freely. I have signed documentation." "She was under coercion," Bernard argued, "fleeing, desperate. She was not in a condition to consent." "She was in perfect condition," Dr. Vincent intervened. "I examined her before the wedding at Mr. Montgomery's request. Sane of mind, physically recovered, no signs of coercion. In fact, she seemed freer and happier than patients usually are." Bernard realized he was losing. He got desperate. "I don't care about papers or priests," he hissed. "She's coming back with me. Her father owes me. I paid good money." "How much?" Edward asked suddenly. Bernard blinked. "What? How much does her father owe? How much did you pay?" $20,000, Bernard said, plus accumulated interest, 30,000 in total. Edward went into the house, returned minutes later with a briefcase. He opened it, showing stacks of notes. "Here is 35,000, he said. 5 extra. I pay her father's debt. Now she owes you nothing. And you have no more excuse to pursue her." Bernard looked at the money, tempted, but rage was stronger than greed. "It's not about money," he admitted finally, the truth coming out. "It's about respect. She humiliated me, made a fool of me in front of city society. I will get her back, even if just to break her spirit." And there it was. Raw truth. It wasn't love or right. It was wounded ego and cruelty. Clara felt nausea, but also rage. Her rage surprised her by its intensity. For weeks, she had only fear of Bernard. Now, seeing him there, listening to his words, she felt pure anger. "You will never break me," she said with a voice that trembled with emotion, but not weakness. "Because I am no longer the scared girl who ran from you. I have someone who loves me truly, not as a possession. I have a home. I have a future. And you have nothing but rage and loneliness that you created yourself." Bernard's face twisted in fury. He took a step toward Clara, raising the cane threateningly. Edward moved like lightning, grabbing the cane in the air, twisting and ripping it from Bernard's hands. His thugs reacted, drawing weapons, but Edward's hands were faster, rifles aimed. The standoff became tense. Violence hung in the air like a stretched rope about to snap. And if you are enjoying this incredible story, leave that like to help me keep bringing these emotional tales. "Enough," Father Lucas said with a voice that echoed with authority. "Mr. Vance, you have lost. Clara made a choice. She is married. The debt is paid. You have no more legal or moral reason to be here. Leave before this ends with blood that will stain the souls of all present." Bernard looked around. He was surrounded, outnumbered, without legal basis. But men like him don't accept defeat easily. "This isn't over," he said to Clara, voice low and venomous. "I will destroy your reputations. I will spread that you are a whore, that you sold yourself to a rich farmer. I will make your life a social hell." "Do what you want," Edward said calmly. "We don't care about gossip. We live here, far from the capital, far from a society that values appearance more than substance, and my reputation is solid enough to survive your poisons." Bernard realized he had lost completely. Without violence as an option, without legal pressure, without effective social leverage, Clara had escaped. He took the cane Edward returned with contempt, turned and walked back to the carriage. Before entering, he looked at Clara one last time. "You will regret it," he said. "When he tires of you, when he realizes he bought defective merchandise, you will wish you had stayed with me." Clara held Edward's hand. "Never," she said, "because he loves me." And you don't even know what that word means. Bernard entered the carriage, slammed the door, ordered the driver to depart. The carriage moved away down the dusty road, taking away the threat that had hung over Clara for months. When the sound of wheels disappeared in the distance, Clara collapsed. Her legs failed, and she fell to her knees in the dirt, sobbing. Edward caught her in his arms, holding her while she cried. They were tears of relief, of released fear, of trauma finally having permission to exit. "It's over," Edward whispered, stroking her hair. "It's over, my love. You are safe." The following days were of emotional recovery. Clara had faced the demon and survived, but the cost was high. She had nightmares, woke up sweating and screaming. Edward stayed with her, held her, reminded her she was safe, that Bernard had gone and wouldn't return. Father Lucas visited, talked at length with Clara about forgiveness and healing. "You don't need to forgive him," said the priest, "but you need to release the anger, or it will poison your happiness." Dr. Vincent also helped, explaining that what Clara felt was normal after trauma. "It takes time," he said gently, "but you have something many victims don't have: support, love, security. You will heal." And gradually, she healed. Weeks turned into months. Winter arrived in the valley, bringing heavy frosts and mornings where breath froze in the air. Clara and Edward huddled near the fireplace, talking for hours, building intimacy that had started in extraordinary circumstances but now deepened in the everyday. It was on a July night, with rare snow falling outside, that they finally consummated the marriage. It wasn't out of obligation or haste, but genuine mutual desire, love that had grown strong enough to withstand the vulnerability of physical intimacy. Edward was gentle, patient, attentive to her every reaction. Clara discovered that physical love could be beautiful when based on respect and affection, not possession and violence. Afterward, lying intertwined, she said quietly, "Thank you." "For what?" he asked, caressing her arm. "For giving me back to myself," she replied. "I was lost, and you found me in every way possible." He kissed her, too moved for words. Spring arrived, bringing visible transformation. Clara was no longer a guest or refugee. She was the lady of Willow Creek Estate. She assumed responsibilities with Mrs. Higgins, modernized the house administration, created a medicinal herb garden, renovated the library. She rode through the fields with Edward, opining on farm decisions, learning about cattle and wool and business. Neighbors initially gossiped, of course. Quick marriage, age difference, her mysterious past, but Clara faced local society with dignity and grace. She went to parties, received visits, showed she had nothing to be ashamed of. And Edward by her side, proud and protective, silenced critics with an icy stare. It was in October, a year after Clara's escape, that she had the idea. She was in the village helping Mrs. Higgins with shopping when she saw a young girl, no more than 18, with a poorly hidden bruise on her face and fear in her eyes that Clara recognized immediately. She approached gently, offered conversation. The girl, Julia, hesitantly told her story. Married for 6 months to a violent man, wanted to run but had nowhere to go, neither family nor money. Clara took Julia home, talked to Edward. "We have so much space," she said, "so many empty rooms. What if we could help? Women like me, like Julia, who need refuge." Edward looked at his wife, saw the fire in her eyes, and fell even more in love. "Let's do it," he said. "Let's turn part of the estate into a shelter." And they did. They renovated the east wing of the house, creating individual rooms. Established rules. Women fleeing violence or desperate situations could come, stay as long as they needed without invasive questions. They would work on the farm if they wanted and could, helping in the kitchen, gardens, learning trades. Clara would teach reading and writing to those who didn't know. Edward would provide legal and physical protection. The first was Julia. The second came 2 months later, Antonia, a widow with marks of abuse from her deceased husband, without resources. The third, the fourth. The news spread discreetly. There was a place where desperate women could find safety. Father Lucas initially worried about scandal, but when he saw the good being done, he became an ally. He helped find families willing to employ the women when they were ready to start over. Dr. Vincent treated physical and emotional wounds for free. Willow Creek Estate transformed. It was still a productive, profitable farm, but it was also a sanctuary. There were children running in the gardens now, children of the sheltered women. There was laughter where before there was only silence. There was life. Clara bloomed. She found purpose. Every woman she helped was a piece of herself being healed. And Edward, seeing his wife save others as she herself had been saved, felt immense pride. 2 years after the wedding, in March 1936, Clara realized she was pregnant. She was afraid to tell Edward, remembering Isabel. But he wept with joy when he found out, and along with joy there was peace. It wasn't a betrayal of Isabel's memory. It was a continuation of her life in a different way. The pregnancy was peaceful. Clara worked until the last month, stubborn as always. In December 1936, Marina was born, healthy and with powerful lungs. Edward held his daughter with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face, and whispered, "Isabel, thank you for bringing Clara to me, and thank you for this blessing." Clara listened from the bed, exhausted but happy, and cried too. Because love isn't betrayal of a previous love. It is expansion. It is continuity. It is proof that the heart can carry memories and create new moments simultaneously. Years passed like rivers, flowing constant, but always changing. Marina grew up surrounded by love, a smart and curious girl. Willow Creek Estate prospered. The shelter helped dozens of women over the years. Some stayed months, others years. Many restarted lives, married again to better men, opened their own businesses. All carried gratitude. Clara never saw Bernard Vance again. She learned from newspaper reports years later that he had died of a heart attack in the city, bankrupt after years of mismanagement and gambling. She felt pity, not joy. Pity for a life wasted in anger and control. Edward aged with dignity. His hair turned completely white, but his eyes kept their shine. He continued managing the farm with Clara by his side, teaching Marina about land and responsibility and love. 8 years after that rainy night when Clara fainted at the gates, on a clear autumn morning in 1942, Edward and Clara sat on the veranda of the big house. Marina, 6 years old, played in the garden with children of 2 of the sheltered women. Mrs. Higgins, now with hair completely white but still active, brought tea and biscuits. Edward held Clara's hand, intertwining their fingers. "You saved me," he said quietly. Clara smiled. "I thought it was you who saved me." He shook his head. "I found you physically, but you saved me truly. You brought me back to life, taught me it is possible to love again without betraying the past. Gave me purpose, family, joy." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other then," she said. "That's what love does, isn't it? 2 broken people joining the pieces and creating something new and whole." They stayed like that for a long time, watching their daughter play, listening to laughter coming from the house where women they helped chatted while preparing lunch, feeling the fresh autumn breeze that brought the scent of wet earth and the promise of a bountiful harvest. Life hadn't been perfect. There were challenges, difficult moments, nights of nightmares and days of doubt. But there was also love. True love, built on a foundation of respect, mutual protection, and the daily choice to remain together. Clara sometimes thought of that storm night, when she fled in desperation, not knowing where she was going, guided only by survival instinct. She thought of the iron gates where she fainted, of the strong arms that carried her to safety, of the sad eyes that slowly learned to smile again because of her. Destiny, she thought, or divine providence. Call it what you wanted, the result was the same. In the darkest moment of her life, when she was most lost and most afraid, the universe had guided her exactly where she needed to be. To the arms of a man who needed her as much as she needed him. To a home that would become a refuge, not just for her, but for dozens of others. To a love that wasn't easy or simple, but that was real and lasting and transformative. Marina ran to the veranda, cheeks rosy from playing. "Mama, Papa, look what I found!" She showed a yellow wildflower she had picked. "It's beautiful, my love," Clara said, taking the flower and placing it in her daughter's hair. "As beautiful as you." Marina laughed and ran back to play. Edward squeezed Clara's hand. "She will grow up knowing what true love is," he said. "She will grow up strong and free. Everything you didn't have the chance to be when you were young." "But I am now," Clara replied. "Thanks to you, thanks to us." The sun began to set, painting the fields in gold. The oaks cast long shadows. Smoke rose from the house chimneys, carrying the smell of baking bread. Horses neighed in the stables. Farm life continued its eternal rhythm. And there on the veranda, Edward and Clara remained together, survivors of storms that almost destroyed them, builders of a shelter that saved many, living examples that true love isn't found in perfect fairy tales, but in the imperfect choices of real people who decide, day after day, to love despite scars, heal despite pain, and build despite ruins. Years later, when they were already old and Marina had children of her own, people in the region still told the story of the wealthy widower who found a lost girl at his farm gates on a stormy night, the story of love that was born of despair and blossomed into hope, the story of two broken souls who fixed one another. And whenever they told it, they ended the same way. It was the most beautiful love story those lands ever saw, not because it was easy, but because it was true. Because in the end, the most beautiful stories aren't those without pain. They are those where pain was transformed into purpose, where fear was overcome by courage, where loneliness was cured by companionship, where two lost people found each other and together discovered the way home. And home, Edward and Clara learned, isn't a place. It is a person. It is the hand you hold in the storm. It is the eyes that see your soul and don't run. It is the voice that says you are safe and keeps the promise. It is the love that doesn't give up, even when everything seems lost. That was what they built, not just in the years since that rainy night, but in every dawn after, in every choice to stay together when it would be easier to give up, in every forgiveness offered, in every wound tended, in every shared laugh, in every tear wiped away. They built love. True, imperfect, strong, lasting, the kind of love that leaves a legacy, the kind of love that transforms not just the lovers, but everyone around them. And when they were very old, sitting on the same veranda decades later, grandchildren running in the gardens where Marina had run, Edward looked at Clara, white hair, face marked by time, but eyes still bright, and said, "Thank you for fainting at my gates." Clara laughed, a sound he never tired of hearing. "Thank you for finding me," she replied. And they stayed there, hands intertwined as they had always been since that distant day, watching the sun set over the fields of Willow Creek Estate, over the refuge they built, over the life they chose together. Because in the end, love isn't about grand gestures or cinematic moments. It is about choosing the same person repeatedly. It is about building shelter for one another when the world is a storm. It is about transforming iron gates into portals for a new beginning. And that, they said for generations throughout the valley region, was the most beautiful love story between the wealthy widower and the young woman he found lost and afraid. Because he found her, she saved him, and together they built a love that saved many others. And in the end, isn't that what all love should do? Overflow, heal not just the lovers, but the world around them. Leave things a little better than they were. Edward and Clara did that, and their love, born of despair on that storm night in March 1934, continued living for generations, in the stories told, in the women they saved, in the descendants they raised with love and dignity. In Willow Creek Estate, which remained decades later, as a symbol that there is always hope, there is always a new beginning, there is always the possibility of true love, even when everything seems lost. That was their story, the most beautiful, the truest, the one that started with fear and ended with love that transformed everything.